So this is joint work with Ziad Obermeyer, and I'll talk about a few things from other papers, and I'll call those out as I proceed. I'm going to work my way up to the topic of human error. I'm going to start with a bigger picture issue of sort of, I'm going to call it making sense of social systems. And it was a way for me to think about and reflect on maybe the work that I've been doing over the last 20 years and how machine learning and other tools like that could integrate into that work. So let me start by just sort of taking a paper that's a very old paper of mine just to contextualize who I am and where I come from. This is a graph on unemployment over about a decade in the United States. The most noticeable thing in this graph is that there's a big racial divide. African Americans experiencing much higher rates of unemployment. In fact, if you look anything in the labor market, African Americans have much worse performance. This is a kind of problem that I think of as a systems problem. There's an aggregate outcome or an outcome in the world that we care a lot about. Why is this happening? And I think in making sense of systems, there's sort of a way that I and many others might proceed. There's a set of this which is about, well, let's first figure out what the facts are. And this usually means trying to understand exactly what's happening, like here's a gap. Then after we have the facts, we might want to go and figure out, well, why is it happening? What's the mechanisms? What are the things that are happening? So along this direction, an experiment that Marianne Bertrand and I did was starting with that initial motivating fact was to ask, if African Americans do so differently in the labor market, how much of this is due to discrimination? And how would we be able to look and see if African Americans are treated differently than whites? So what we did was an experiment where we sent out resumes like this. Except before we sent them out, we randomly assigned different names to them. So some of them received very white names, some of them received stereotypically African-American names. And it was a fairly simple design that was just meant to take identical resume pools, thousands of them, and simply just ask what happens if we simply flip a Q that indicates African-Americanness. And what you find is, in fact, unfortunately, the callback rates for white names were about 50% higher. Were about 50% higher than the callback rates for black resumes. And this is the kind of thing that I think happens in this literature, which is trying to start with a fact like this, and then to say, let's do some detective work, empirical work, causal inference work, to say something about what is the mechanism underneath it. Let's try and understand what's happening. Then following this, we would typically move to the next stage, which is let's try to build some interventions around this. I'm not going to go in detail in this particular thing, but to sort of foreshadow where we might be headed, I think the work on building interventions, largely in this particular case, if we think about discrimination, kind of goes forward and asks, well, what's the source of that discrimination? And I think what the literature has sort of settled on is that actually a surprising big fraction of it are behavioral biases as opposed to actual animus. And so the final piece is going to be that. And so it's been work like this, which is as a way to understand and build interventions, it's been to sort of take behavioral insights about human beings and to recognize that people may do quite strange things. And I hope you see what's bizarre about this. If not, well, you know, I'm happy for you. And so that's the final piece. We might build interventions off of this. We might take the understanding. We might say, let's get rid of the bad interventions, like building escalators, places where we shouldn't. And that's the overall arc. Now, I think that it's fair to say that for the bulk of my career, it's been sort of causal inference tools play a central part of every part of this step. Maybe the documenting of facts, not so much. But certainly in the understanding, then in the testing of interventions, it's sort of what I think social science has become good at in the last 25 years is finding ways to feasibly get causal inference from data. And whether that's using naturally occurring data or whether it's going out and running experiments like in the resume experiment. In the last 4 or 5 years, I've been sort of thinking about, well, what about predictive tools, ML tools? What's their role in this whole pipeline? Can they be helpful in this activity? And what I want to do today is I want to sort of take an example, and I want to walk through that example end to end, so to speak. And that example is going to be in a space that is, I think, another equivalent system that's a big system, which is healthcare. Healthcare is super expensive, and it's got a lot of weird stuff going on. For example, a common fact in this space is that 1/3 of healthcare is spent on things that don't make people any healthier. That's $765 billion in waste. One of the striking things about healthcare is that even tiny gains, 1% gains, quickly end up in the billions. It is a huge system. We see things like this: medicine's making us sicker, physician. So healthcare is full of these sort of system problems. An example, and the example in healthcare that I want to focus on just as a stereotyped example is, picture you have somebody walk in to an emergency room and they list some of these symptoms. Let's say they list, I'm sweating, I have shortness of breath, maybe I feel some chest pain. Now, that's a subset of the constellation of symptoms with this thing that we associate with, which is heart attack. And if people have some of these systems, it's the physician's job to diagnose whether or not they are actually having a heart attack. And one of the striking things in the literature is when we look at that test or any other such test, for example, with heart attack, I'll show you what it is, but we'll push people through what's a stress test as an example. That's an expensive test. One thing that's a key fact in the literature about all testing is that they have very low yield. Most tests find nothing. And that's extremely expensive. And the current analysis of the system for this heart attack test is that tests are often negative, the interventions don't do much benefit, and our understanding of what's happening is physicians have incentives to do a lot more. Why? Because they are paid by the test. So our understanding is the fact is low average yield. The reason is, obviously, if you pay people to test people, guess what? They test lots of people. So it's not much of a surprise. Our interventions then are align physicians with payer incentives. It's let's change the payment system. So that's our current understanding. I'm sure that my health economics colleagues would enjoy having all of their understanding put onto a PowerPoint slide with fairly business school-like snazzy fonts. Please don't tell me that's not a snazzy font. So this is how we make sense of social systems. What I want to kind of think about now is go back to the original thing and say, isn't it funny that the testing problem is actually at its heart a machine learning problem? Because after all, there is an element where if you look at the testing decision, it's that you see a bunch of symptoms. Let's call that the X's. There is a Y, which is hidden at the time that you see the X's. Make the Y be, is it a heart attack? Or even more prosaically, would a test find something positive? And the doctor has a clear prediction problem. Given X, forecast Y. And if Y is high, test those people. So it's interesting that this is clearly a prediction problem. We're used to thinking of medicine as being the home of causal inference. Give a drug, not a drug. But actually, many, many things, especially diagnosis, is a prediction problem. Now, of course, in the automation literature and machine learning, this is very well understood. And that's why there's so much ML in healthcare, is that we have things that look at X-rays or MRIs or retinal images and try to automate the problem of diagnosis, or even some techniques that are trying to automate other pipelines. But what I want to just say is that I think we can use that same prediction framework that is kind of latent in automation to make sense of the testing behaviors of physicians and try to understand what's going on with the same original fact. And that's what I'm going to try and do. I'm going to try and use machine learning to make sense of the fact. So we have this fact that there's lots of apparently low average yields. Can we unpack that fact more? And then as we unpack it, what does that tell us about, what's actually happening? And finally, this is where I'll get to the final part, where I think this is where the machine learning kind of almost leads us to a certain point, but will eventually stop, which is what interventions can we have based on that understanding. So that's going to be my pipeline today. So let me start with the medical context and go to the heart attack problem a little bit more closely. I hope that what you take away from this is not something narrow about heart attacks, neither in the sense of what you should do if you feel chest pain, nor in the sense of oh wow, we've learned something about heart attacks. I hope that you appreciate that there's a bit of metaphor in what I'm trying to do, and I'll talk about that later if people would like, but this is kind of a canonical problem in medicine, but it's also kind of a canonical problem that shows up in lots of social systems where there's a decision maker who's making a decision that's effectively a testing-like or sorting-like decision. And we can talk about that. So, but just so you know the exact thing I'm talking about, I'm going to go through medical context. So the context is you get a patient with suspicious symptoms walks in the door. What the physician has to do is decide what to do beyond sort of simple tests, like let me poke around and touch, et cetera. It turns out some simple tests that are actually somewhat helpful is that people will say things like, I have chest pain. And chest pain is actually quite hard, given the way the bundles of nerves work, to differentiate from abdominal pain. So often, the single biggest reason that people come in with chest pain is that they had Indian food last night. Well, I'm allowed to say that. But what we do after that sort of simple triage, the obvious stuff, is that we then run people through more complicated gamuts of tests. In particular, you leave people in for observations overnight, and you do a set of other tests. Stress tests are the first things. This is one where I put you onto something like a treadmill, and I might have a heart monitor or some other devices popped on. And as I get your heart rate up, I see if something weird happens to the EKG or other things I decide to measure about heart function. Or I could say, wow, you look really bad, and I go straight for catheterization. I'm going to go straight in and look for problems. And if the stress test is positive, it usually has a pathway to catheterization. So we're going to call these the tests. And when people come in, the physician has a crucial choice to make, and a pretty expensive choice, because these run in the thousands, tens of thousands. And they're also not particularly pleasant for the patient to be spending overnight at the hospital. Who knows what else they have going on in their lives. And catheterization is quite an invasive procedure. So these are expensive both to patients and to the system. And the doctor has to decide, who do I do these on? And the result is, if we find something in this package of tests, we get to do an intervention. We get to actually act on this. The reason it's important to act is that these tests are costly, but the interventions have a good cost benefit if we find the right people to do them on. And the reason it's important is that if you have a heart attack and the doctor lets you go home untreated, so you're fine, you had a heart attack, and yeah, it's fine, you didn't die right then and there, that's a problem. An untreated heart attack leads to a high rate of fatalities. Some estimates can put it at about 10 to 20% fatalities in the follow-up period. And that's usually from the scarring from the previous heart attack that's there. And that scarring has a chance to produce a lot of, the heart is a complex system that requires an enormous amount of synchrony from all the neurons to be firing together. Scarring is what creates potential problems with synchrony, because as the electrical signal goes through, it hits the scar, and now it's not reaching the other cells at the right time, and which is what creates weird, unfortunate rhythms. So that's, in general, we're trying to deal with the scars right when they happen. If we don't, we get an untreated heart attack. And there are other delayed complications. So treatment is not just about immediate life-saving maneuvers, it's about these type of things to deal with the scarring, et cetera. So we'd like to get the people who had heart attacks, figure out who they are, and treat them immediately. And if we do, there sort of can be huge benefits, sort of 50% reduction in mortality and sequelae. Now notice, these come from treatment control studies. This comes from a causal pipeline. But I'm taking this causal pipeline as given, and now I'm going to proceed with a predictive model. What I want to ask is, what drives the testing decision? And in particular, I'm going to set up a framework where the assumptions behind that testing decision are the following: that if we do a test, we'd rather do it to someone who goes on to get intervention than not. This is a fairly simple thing, that the benefit of the tests are all concentrated on the positives, that there are no other benefits to the test if the test found nothing. In effect, I'm sort of just laying out a framework in which, if Y is the positiveness of the test and there's a treatment benefit, that we can decompose and sort of say that the net benefit of testing someone is on the positives times the treatment effect conditional on finding something. And one thing I'm going to abstract from in this talk is the covariance between the predictive positiveness and the treatment benefit. I'm going to assume a homogeneous treatment benefit or a treatment benefit that's increasing in your chance of finding something. We can go back to that later. I think that's a specific assumption. I think it's a realistic assumption for most people in the data, and if people are interested, we can talk about why that's not. So then I'm going to, what this results in is that what matters is who should you test. Given the x's, we're trying to sort people to find the expected yield of testing, and we'd like to test people whose expected yield is above some threshold. That's what this model is going to produce. And the reason this is interesting is now it's a prediction problem. We would have a treatment rule, a testing rule, which is given the x's, figure out y hat, the probability that the test will find something, and test people whose y hat is above some cost-benefit threshold. I'm going to try and model the cost-benefit, but you can see it's basically a binary rule that's test above some certain threshold. OK, so let's just get through what the prediction problem is. To set this up, we have a ton of data. I'm going to talk about two data sources. I won't get into the exact detail. One is electronic health record data, which has a rich set of data. The other, which I'll sometimes draw on, is claims data, which is much bigger and from national data. And it's in the millions. It's basically most everybody over the age of 65. But the key thing is that we have a ton of prior data. What diagnosis and procedures, what labs and vital signs, medications prescribed. So we have a ton of the data the physician sees. Of course, I'm going to flag something that's going to prove important later. There's a ton of other things that the physician sees that we don't always necessarily have. So we might have things like chief complaint. But even in the best electronic health record, we don't have really good data on the patient's appearance and physical exam, just to illustrate. The doctor gets to see the patient. We have some ex post notes that we can process, but ultimately, at best, we have a sort of screened sample. And so what we're going to do is we're at an information disadvantage at some level, which is going to prove important. But the algorithm is going to use these data to form this prediction. And I want to flag this for a second, because I think when we take these problems as a pure prediction problem, we sometimes forget the human advantage that's in a lot of these problems. The human decision maker sees a lot of things that we don't see. OK. The setup is what you'd imagine. There's a time of the ED visit. There's tests and outcomes happen after. There's a bunch of data that we have before in the prior period. We're just going to train an algorithm on this and look over the final period. This I'm going to go through fairly fast. It's what you would expect. There's a train set. There's a holdout set. Everything that you would have kind of wanted us to do, hopefully we've done, making sure that we don't have the same patient visit if they have two visits here and here, so that there isn't any leakage, things like that. So I'll skip through this. Basically, we fit some gradient boosted trees. I don't think the exact model is that important, but if you're interested. So let's see what we find. The fact that we started with was that the average yield rates are really low, and that we're not testing. So let's look at the individual level yields. So if you remember, the key empirical fact was low average yield. Tests are often negative. Interventions don't benefit. What I think the algorithm lets us do is actually something quite interesting. Why were we looking at average yield rates to make a statement about whether doctors are doing a good job? Interestingly, I told you the threshold model. So what we really care about is not the average, but the marginal tested. So if I drew the distribution and we thought people were testing, doctors were setting the threshold too low in the risk distribution, the average could still be high because they're picking up a bunch of high risks over there, and they're still screwing up at the margin. So let's look at the nice thing about by having an entire p-hat distribution is that we can look at the entire testing distribution. So now what I'm going to do is to look at the distribution of yield and the marginal yield. So here is predicted risk put into some deciles, and here is the yield of the test, people who actually go on to get intervened. And what you see is that the lowest decile has a 1.7% yield, which is quite a bit different than than if we had just looked at the average of the tested. In fact, you can see it quite strongly if I put it into cost-benefit terms. The bottom 40% of tests have about a $578,000 per year cost. Since as economists we like to put numbers on everything, you'll be happy to know we've also put a number on the value of human life. It's $100,000 per year, which is a weirdly round number. I don't know why, but nevertheless, at least gives us a benchmark. The reason we think testing is really inefficient is this is a very, very expensive yield rate at the bottom. It's interesting to note the average yield is at about 281, which just shows that even in this sort of over-testing framework, not having used this sort of careful predictive model was leading us to even understate the extent of the overtesting problem. 40% of tests are far less efficient than the average would have led you to believe, which suggests that overtesting is far more pernicious than you might have imagined. And it's a simple piece of math, really. If the average was low, odds are the margin is really, really low, given that at least some people should be getting tested. So here I put some things in here, which is the fraction of tests. Like if we did the 80%, we're at nearly $750,000 a year. And I've just put, that's about $890,000 per year. So you can see as you map out the distribution, the cost effectiveness thresholds are really quite high, and there are a lot of really pointless tests that are being done. I'll go past this. So that's the first fact, which I think is a fact that reinforces our earlier understanding of the problem, but perhaps magnifies that understanding a bit. What's funny about this curve is that when you look down here, okay, that's fine. But what about the people up here? These people have very high rates of discovery. They're very cost efficient, 42%. But what's weird about them is only 17% are being tested. So when we look at the testing pool down here, we're like, wow, why are you bothering to test these people? But now that you have the entire p-hat distribution, you can equally ask, wait, why are we not testing all of these people? Kind of an odd situation. And it's not something that's in the original framework because we had no real way of talking about these other people. And so what could be going on with this population? How do we think about these untested people who look to be very high risk? Well, the problem here is what would have happened had we tested them? What we really have is an untested population in the top risk decile that were never tested. So I don't know, what would have happened? This is the outcome of testing, which we don't observe, because when the test is 0, we just do not know what happened. This we've called the selective labels problem because it actually shows up in a bunch of these type of things. It's closest to a selective measurement problem where we measure a certain outcome for only subsamples. When the doctor tests, we see the outcome. When the doctor doesn't test, we don't see the outcome. This problem is actually often solved implicitly or explicitly by using some form of generate predictions for the untested set. You could do a matching estimator. You could do, there's just many different ways of describing it, and a lot of statistics. But in the end, what it comes down to in the best case scenario is some sort of conditional on the full vector of x's. I'm going to assume that the y's for the people who look like you on the x's are the same between the tested and the untested. So whatever the procedure you use to get to that point, and there can be a lot of different procedures, I think this is the core assumption underneath the way most times we solve this problem in this literature. Now, the problem with that is that it requires an exceedingly strong assumption. If you take in mind what this is saying, it's implicitly saying two people walk in who look very similar. The doctor chose to test one, didn't choose to test the other. By making this assumption, we're saying that the doctor's test decision has no additional signal, that the doctor has no private information. We might call this selection on observables. You know what else we could call it? The doctor is an idiot and is just flipping a coin. This is a randomization assumption. The doctor might as well just be flipping a coin because that's what we're going to be assuming. In effect, we're assuming that the doctor has exactly no extra knowledge beyond what's in our data, which is a kind of strong assumption to make, and it leads to some, I'll skip this for a minute, it leads to some kind of pernicious things. Notably, we know that there's private information. Let me show you how extreme this is in our data. One piece of private information that the doctor has, this is unobserved by the algorithm. These are sort of z variables beyond the x's. They're z's unobserved by the algorithm but observed by the doctor. A noteworthy one is we don't have the ECG. Well, that's not true. We have the ECG, but it's not used. We can talk about ways to use it, not use it. So in the predictor I showed you, we didn't use the full ECG, but the doctor did. And so it's not implausible that the cardiologist diagnosis in the ECG says something, et cetera. One reason we don't use it is that the cardiologist diagnosis comes many days later, so it would be a little bit like peeking into the future. Having said that, of course, we can train an algorithm to read the ECG and predict the cardiologist diagnosis, which we do. We can go into what we want, but we predict a bunch of ECG features, which we correlate with risk, and we come up with we have our current risk, which is based on all the other stuff I told you, and now we have an additional risk that we predict just from the ECG. And that's what I did. Now let's show that what happens if in this same thing, what I've done here is I've taken the original quartiles of risk, and I've now broken the data up into ECG risk quartiles, which are the additional risk. And no surprise, at every quartile, doctors test more when the ECG looks problematic. Now, what's funny is, without the ECG data, we're treating all of this variation as effectively noise. Well, why is the doctor testing these people? Why are they failing to test these people? Well, these people had a low ECG risk, but we would just be like, why are they not testing them? And in fact, you see the lowest risk ECG has a 75% lower test rate. And when you go look at the yield rates, it's a little harder to see here, but you can see the yields line up exactly as this. The ECG, even conditional on our risk factor, has a huge amount of signal. This is just by way of saying that if we had failed to incorporate this thing, this has an 86% lower yield rate, if we had failed to incorporate this information, should I go through this? Yeah, you can kind of see this because I'll use this later. This is the risk quintile from the usual predictor. This includes the ECG predictor, so it's the re-ranking. And you can see that there's an enormous movement of people in this direction, that there's a downward resorting, because when we've added the ECG information, the untested ends up looking a lot less riskier than we thought they did, because that was unknown information to us. Okay, and this is just by way of saying the ECG is just one example. The ECG predicts testing, predicts risk. It was something that we don't have included, but there are so many things that have variables like this, which leaves us with a conundrum, and I think it's one of the core conundrums in using machine learning to do these type of system diagnosis, is even when the problem is such a clear prediction problem like this, it has, because of the lack of labels, and we're calling it a selective lack of labels because it's the system's decision or the doctor's decision of who to generate labels on, and it's based on private information, we can't do this. I'll just say that I think this is a generic problem. Whenever we're going to go and compare and try and understand human error, we will always have this problem. So for example, in other work, we've looked at judicial decision making and whether judges are making the right decision. And there are a lot of papers that do that now, but if you think about it, how could we ever test judicial decision making when we don't get any data on the people judges jail? What are we comparing it to? It's a very similar problem. And I think it's been largely ignored in the literature. I don't mean ignored. I mean the selection on unobservables problem is largely ignored. I think that some form of correction here is I must have all the X's, which again, I just want to reinforce that is equivalent to the human decision maker randomizing conditional on X's, which is a pretty strong assumption because that means you already know there's a ton of error. Why are you randomizing? So I just want to emphasize, I think that the role of unobservables is one of the things I would take much more seriously in the social science applications, because unlike many automation frames, there are a ton of data the human decision maker uses that the algorithm doesn't have access to. So let's talk about two strategies for inference. In this case, one strategy for inference is, yes, the people we didn't test, we don't know what the test would have produced. But they go home, and we get to see a bunch of other stuff about them. So one of the consequences of letting a heart attack go untreated is there are consequential problems. We can look and see what happens to the untested on other outcomes. So the first example is let's look at things like troponin and other subsequent heart attacks. And what you see is in the untested population, if you look over the next 180 days, the untested have a huge fraction of heart attacks. And depending on how sharply we put the troponin threshold, this is a test you use to decide whether you've had a severe heart attack, the people that were untested on this visit go on to come back and then show enough symptoms that they're tested and the troponin levels prove to be very high. And it's actually at ridiculously high rates. If you use a low threshold, it's up to about 22%, which is a very high heart attack rate in the population. Okay, even a 0.1, which is a very severe heart attack, we're at about 8%. So what to make of this? Well, let me skip this part. Let me just show you another one, which is if you then look at mortality over the next year, the people who look to be high predicted risk who are untested go on to have about a 16% mortality rate, which is significantly higher than base rate. If you look at coming back in for cardiac arrest, they're about 4x base rate. So this is some indirect evidence that some of that 83% that are untested in the high yield in the high group are in fact quite risky and should be tested, and is not simply the physician having private information. Because certainly at these levels, we would have wanted to test at least some of these people. Of course, that alone doesn't tell us enough. So a second approach is to, even though we're sitting in a machine learning framework, is to use some of the tricks that we've used in the causal inference framework. And the trick there is to say, let's find natural variation. And what kind of variation do we want here? We want variation in testing rates, because people who test a lot more reveal more of the labels further out in the distribution. And so here, we're going to use a fact that is used in the health economics literature, which is physician variation in who gets tested. And with a little bit of care, you can sort of set up some pseudo-random assignment situations where it's a function of which physician happened to be on duty when you went in. And that gives us something that's simulating an RCT. Notice we're not using the RCT for RCT-like thing for purposes that are usually what you might think, which is the effect of some treatment. Here, we're just using the variation to reveal more labels and figure out what do those labels look like. So the natural experiment here is going to be about daytime versus overnight. So in daytime, there's a bunch of overlapping physicians in each pod, and physicians self-assign to patients. So in that sense, during the day, you would be wary of using which physician you go to, because there's a bunch of physicians. But if you show up at the ED at night, there's one physician per pod. And as a result, it's your luck of the draw of who happened to be on shift. Second fact, everyone does overnights. There's no choice of patients. By the way, this one is my co-author Ziad is a doctor, and he wanted to put that in bold and underlined. And I don't know what kind of problems he has with overnights, but it feels like he's particularly unhappy with this. Everyone does overnights. Moreover, testing varies quite a bit by doctor. There's huge variation between the high test doctors and the low test doctors. It's like there's just a style you approach this problem, which should already tell you something weird is going on, because the X distribution are the same across doctors. But for our purposes, this gives us a great experiment. When we look at all the observed characteristics, age and Y hat, those appear to be balanced, and we can talk about that. What can we learn from variation across doctors? So let's look at them. The doctor who tests everyone, they have some high risk, lots of low risk, versus the low testing doctor. Hopefully they only test the high risk patients, hopefully. Hopefully we'll get a chance by looking at this difference, what's in the middle, to look at what the marginal patients look like and whether they're calibrated across our models. So what I want to do is to basically use a procedure that we've used in this work on Bale. I want to use it here, which is imagine starting with the highest quartile doctors who test a lot and contracting down. So we'll use the algorithm to cut the tests all the way down. And that'll get us down to the next lowest testing group for the third quartile doctors, and so on. So we know the observed discovery rate at the third quartile doctor. And so, okay. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm just going to rank these people. We're going to, I'll show you, it's easiest to see in the actual graph. As we move across quartiles, we see that there is, as they cut, there's some drop in yield. This is what the doctors achieve. I could start at this point, and instead of using the natural variation in who gets cut, I'm going to use the algorithm to decide who's going to be cut. And that produces sort of from 4.3 to 2.5%. We have 43% lower yield. This is the algorithm sort of contraction rate on top. And you can see this is super flat. And that's because there are a lot of high-yield, untested, high-yield patients that these doctors are cutting that we will keep and instead cut the very low-yield patients. So implicitly, what you see in this is that the algorithm is pretty well calibrated up to this range of 4.3 to 2.5% at the top levels of yield as well as the low levels. And we can talk about that if we want. We could also do it in the other direction. We can look at the adverse outcomes in the untested patients, because as we contract the set, we're expanding some other set. And in fact, what you find is that going from 2.5 to 4.3% tested, you have still kind of the same MI rate, even though we're doing 72% more tests. Here, we're able to get 61% fewer MIs in the untested population by just picking the right people to leave untested. So between the two of these, you see that on both the top end and the bottom end, the algorithm is doing an extremely good job. And while it may not be fully calibrated within the range that we see physician variation, it does seem to be pretty calibrated. So what I want to say is, the thing I take away from this is the core argument that I had been working with, and I think most of the literature has been working with, is, wow, we have low average yields and tests are often negative. I think that that kind of needs to change, which is it's not so much low average yields, it's that there's some sort of sorting error, that we're both over-testing people of low yield and under-testing people of high yield, which means that we're, in some sense, slightly focusing on the wrong problem, which is I'll come back to at the intervention level. It's not a matter of driving down tests. It's a matter of resorting. In fact, once you resort, you're on a very different trade-off curve. Maybe you want more tests. We don't know. The level of tests is not nearly as important as who gets tested and the sorting of who gets tested. So given that, now we'll get to the thing about why. In the old world, we said, oh, too many tests, it makes sense. Physicians have incentives to do more, they do more. In fact, here, you say, wait, they have incentives to do more. Why are they failing to test some people they should test? Clearly, it can't just be pecuniary self-interest of, like, I want to test as many people as possible. So what's going on? So let's try to figure out what's going on. And to do that, I want to go through the error here and try to do a behavioral diagnostic using the same tools that we've talked about. So we're not just trying to predict an outcome, but almost diagnose the nature of the error. And the way I'm going to do that is going to be, in all honesty, a little clunky. I don't think we found a great automated way of doing it. So this is going to be much closer to me with my crude hands moving the y-hat thing around and comparing it to the human decision and looking for stuff. I think one of the really interesting areas would be to find more systematic ways of uncovering behavioral mechanisms, but I'll tell you what we did crudely, and maybe that'll give some guide to somebody smarter to figure this out. The first thing we did was we started with, what's the challenge of diagnosis? Well, the challenge of diagnosis is not, this is the constellation of all symptoms people have with heart attack. Almost nobody shows up with all the symptoms. People show up with subsets of symptoms. For example, someone would show up with some serious respiratory issues. The challenge of diagnosis is that while coughing, shortness of breath is consistent with heart attack, it is also consistent with pneumonia and with a ton of other diseases. So how do you disentangle whether this is a case of pneumonia or it's a case of heart attack? So what we did was we started with the set of people who have chief complaint shortness of breath. And we said, what if the doctor decides, oh, this is pneumonia? Well, that's good. If they think it's pneumonia, they're likely to, at every decile of risk, especially the high deciles, they're much less likely to test, which makes sense. But does it make sense? If they think it's pneumonia, why shouldn't they also test? In fact, what you find is that there's a 77% likelihood of being tested, but in fact, there is no difference in yield whatsoever between these two populations. It is not the case that what they're doing is that they're testing people with pneumonia and failing to test people with pneumonia, and when they do, they don't find as much. In fact, quite the opposite. We seem to find very high yields even in that population. Another way to put it is that, this is the figure we can go through that. Another way to put it is that they're failing to test this population, but there's no reason to see, there's nothing in the data that says this population is lower risk than the other population. I'm going to show you this again for something else, which is, Let's start with not respiratory diseases, but chest pain. Chest pain has another conflating thing, which is COPD. So we sort of run through this and said for each of these, what might be some conflating diseases? COPD is the other competing diagnosis, differential diagnosis. And again, what you find is here are the people who are tested. And if somebody has a history of COPD in the last 3 years, they're much less likely to be tested. But yet again, when you do test them, you find really high yields. And what I think I want to build up here is one of the things that appears to be going on is doctors applying the principle of Occam's razor. You're sort of taught, if you have disparate symptoms, go with one diagnosis, and medical practice reinforces this. But in fact, what we're finding is the opposite, is that it's Occam's blunder. Because for some weird reason, it turns out that people can have 2 problems, not just 1 problem. And it appears that when you found 1 problem, you shut down the door on the other problem, and those people still remain very high risk. In fact, a big fraction of the under-tested are people who have a history of a diagnosis on a competing diagnosis in the past. So that's one challenge of one source of human error here. Here's another source of interesting error. Besides the symptoms, the demographic plays a big role in who you test. I mean, who you should test, because after all, white males at age 71 versus Hispanic females at age 50. There's a lot of demographic groups. And those demographic groups dictate the base rates at which the chances there's a heart attack. So if you just wrote a Bayesian model, there's the base rate, which is determined by demographics, and then there's the symptoms, which is the signal that you should update on. What's interesting is that doctors do a shockingly good job of this. All we've done is test rates against demographic groups, these 3 type demographic bins. The sizes are not indicative of anything except age. It's not like the cells are bigger because this is these sizes. And they're actually really correlated. They test the bins much more that have high base rate risk. So in this sense, they're following Bayes' rule quite well, which is interesting because in the behavioral literature, one of the things that we've often talked about is base rate ignorance, that people overweight symptoms. But here, if anything, the base rate is being used quite a bit. And I was shocked to see this, that they actually get this by bin pretty. I mean, it's not perfect. There are obviously lots of things off the line, but they're quite correlated. On the other hand, there's something weird that does happen, which is here what I've done is I put predicted risk on the x-axis, the total predicted risk, inclusive of demographics. Now I've put the predicted risk of just the demographic component. And in every demographic cell, you see that testing is going up as overall risk goes up. But weirdly, it goes up in this direction as well, which if you think of it as a sufficient statistic is a little weird. Holding constant predicted risk, total predicted risk, physicians still pay attention to the demographic component on top of it. If this were a model and you put things into risk units, this is telling you I put weight greater than 1 on the risk that comes from the demographic component. This is kind of white men greater than 70-year-olds are just ridiculously over-tested relative to what you expect, even putting them into their risk bins. Black women are much less likely to be tested. These are all the bins. So the other thing that seems to pop out of this is that there appears to be a bunch of stereotyping going on, which is not that we ignore the base rate, but we pay too much attention to a base rate. If a white man and a Hispanic woman of lower age come in with very similar symptoms, yes, we should move based on our priors a little bit, but in fact, doctors appear to be moving a lot more. The most salient fact here appears to be demographic. So like I said, this is kind of my crude attempt to sort of cut, using my own intuitions, but it's an attempt to try and understand error using these predictive tools. And it'd be nice to find more systematic ways of intersecting the y hat that we have with the human decision to understand where the errors or the over and under testing are. Here we use a lot of domain knowledge. So instead of physician incentives, I think I would modify the framework to say, actually, we now need to invest a lot more, not just on incentives, but actually in a world where there's just a lot of misprediction, where diagnosis is hard and cognitive errors are a big source of the problem. That brings us to interventions, and that's what I'm going to talk about at the end. Of course, interventions by themselves are inherently going to be in the realm of causal tools, so we're not going to be able to do much more. But I do think this stuff gives us a guidance as to where to look. Let's start with what we do right now. We focus on incentives. And so one way we focus on incentives is that we try to look at people who are less incentivized to do things. What's weird about incentives is that it's not obvious to me that incentives would solve a cognitive error problem. Certainly not incentives that are reduce the incentives to test. Maybe incentives to test more accurately, but that's not what we have in mind. And even more extremely, in the literature, you often move to proxying for incentives with the level of testing. So this is the kind of graph that gives me pause. This was the original physicians of quartile test rates. This was predicted risk. You'll notice when you move down from the highest test to lowest test quartiles, when you encourage these physicians to look more like the low testing and not the high testing, yes, you're getting a little movement down here. You're getting a lot of movement in the high risk bin. So when we're incentivizing people to test less, they are testing less of everybody, which is a little weird. And you see this even in the cross-sectional data. These are what are called HRR testing quintiles. If you've ever read some of Atul Gawande's work, or people in from Dartmouth have some very good stuff, they point out there are big geographic disparities. And we look at regions that are doing a great job. What's a great job? Well, they're not doing a lot of useless tests. This is one such region down here that's not doing a lot of useless tests. It's Boise versus Boston. Boston does a lot of useless tests. Boise does not many. But you'll notice, yes, awesome, they're cutting down here. They're equally cutting up here. So when we lift up some of these regions and say, why can't Boston be more like Boise? We're making an implicit trade-off without even realizing it, in that, are we really saying we want to cut these tests? I think people have in mind that we're just cutting here. But most of the cuts are coming from up here, from the high-risk part. In fact, if I move to the entire quintile, this is where we use the national data, and just break hospitals into the highest risk and lowest risk quintiles. These are the quintiles of testing. And you see very clearly the highest risk quintiles test more of everybody, and the lowest risk test less of everybody. So that might just by saying that we probably ought not to be using so blithely these frameworks as they stand. And that doesn't mean the predictive frameworks tell us what interventions are going to work, but at least they're giving us some guidance that the interventions we have right now might be doing some harm as well as the good we imagine them to be doing. So let me conclude with a very simple thing, which is to say, I like this quote from a very famous statistician, that the best thing about a statistician is that you get to play in everyone's backyard. And what I tried to do in this talk was basically set out an invitation to come play in our backyard. I think diagnosing systems and diagnosing what's going on with overall policies is something that can be incredibly fruitful for a lot of the tools that you have in this room. All right, thank you very much.
So we have some time for questions, and then you're going to be taken then directly, right?
Perfect. Yeah. I think there's a mic coming around if people. Oh. There's a.
So, thank you very much. I think very insightful talk and very thought-stimulating. My concern is that beyond recognizing that the current interventions are not effective, or there might be more effective interventions, there's the problem of sort of the political aspects of how to change people's minds. The people making the decisions are happy with incentives that decrease their costs or their parent costs. And I'm wondering if you have any, I mean, this is more social science than statistics, but if you have any insights on how to go beyond just what are effective interventions, but what are effective communication methods for conveying the alternatives and the value of the alternatives to the audience.
So John Maynard Keynes had a great quote, which I'm going to butcher, but I'll get the spirit of it right, which is, he said that even the most pragmatic-minded person is actually the slave to some defunct economist from 25 years ago. Now, you might think all economists are defunct, but let's put that aside. I'm saying that because this example perfectly illustrates a point, which is so much of the policy, I've worked in a lot of policy areas, and so much of it sits under the sort of insights and ideas that were generated 25 years ago. The reason we're so focused on over-testing is because 25 years ago, we started documenting in the crude ways I described that there was overtesting, which then led to beautiful articles like Atul Gawande's article and so on, which sort of started to popularize this notion that we're doing too much care, which then led to a pipeline of books that made this point, which then has become sort of the gestalt of the thing. And this has happened time and time again, where if there are some core insights that reshape how we think about a particular area, school choice, why shouldn't there be competition between schools? That was an essay by Milton Friedman many, many, many years ago. And through a slow pipeline of diffusion, that's now really quite popular. So I am quite optimistic that if the insights about how to think about an area kind of reshape, it's not in 5 years or 2 years. So with problems like climate change, we can't wait for 25, 30 years. So that required. But for a lot of these problems that are always going to be with us, we're always going to have healthcare, there is an enormous power. We're sitting at one end of this little lever. We push it. It takes time, but the other end really starts to move. And I think part of the reason is undergrads go through, master's students go through, PhD students go through. They start to think about the world differently. They become the social entrepreneurs, the policy entrepreneurs that then carry the ideas forward. I'm not saying it's a hydraulic process where everything works out beautifully, but that there's a lot more leverage, I think, than we might imagine at a 1 to 5 year horizon that we sit in. There's a question over there, and then we can come down on that end, and then we can come down this way. Yeah. It's not that I can't see you, it's that I have a bright light in my face so that I can't see you.
That's all right. So you were talking about the selective labels problem and the question of how we think the sparse positive labels are selected in the first place. And this notion of, even in the real world, people have a tendency to, the way we try to solve it is by applying similar outcomes to similar people. In the machine learning space, for example, that becomes fuzzy because, the notion of similarity is under question all the time. What is your distance metric? Does it even make sense? But even in the space of human decisions, I think that notion of similarity is a function of a lot of things, and not all of those things are under active consideration all the time. So, and when you said this question about, it almost seems like a random process. If I asked a computer scientist, they would be happy about it. Wow, randomness is great. But since you work with behavioral sciences, do you find yourself thinking about empirical methods which show the biases in that stage? Do you actually believe that it's a random process in the real world? Because honestly, I don't. I do believe that there are biases in that stage of selection of those very sparse labels to start with. How do you think those effects can be measured? Because it seems the similar problems that you would have with the prediction itself would also apply to the problem of measuring those effects. So do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I think, if you don't mind a slightly long-winded answer, I think I'd start by saying in the causal inference literature, at least in the areas that I work in, the most fruitful move was a move to raise the bar. And it was a move that says, just because the observables are similar, that doesn't make for prima facie, without anything else, that these two groups are comparable. That we can't just use regression. At the very least, we should see, make sure the X distributions overlap. But for a while, we raised the bar quite a bit more, which is the default would be there's a ton of unobservables that differentiated treated from untreated. Raising that bar forced a lot of creativity of coming up with solutions, natural experiments, et cetera, to find actual variation. By analogy, I think we definitely need to raise the bar for this type of selective labels problem. There are many, many people who are starting to do an exercise that has semantically looks like the following. There's a human decision maker making this choice. I would like to do a prediction problem, and I would like to show that the predictor does better than the human decision maker. But of course, when you go to evaluate your predictor, I would argue you must take into account the selective labels problem, and you must give the human the benefit of the doubt that there is some unobservables that they might see that you might not. I think that's a good discipline for us to have as a field. What do I think is going to happen? In the work we did on judges, when we took that really carefully into account, we spent a lot of time on trying to find exogenous variation. I think what we found there was slightly different than this. Here we find there is some private signal, but there's still the algorithm still seems to do well on top of the private signal. In the judges, we're finding the judge's decisions appear to be pure noise. And we can even beat the judge simply by predicting what the judge would do, not even the eventual outcome. And the prediction of the judge, which is a denoise version, beats the judge. And the key why I feel comfortable making these statements is I'm not saying beats the judge just on observables, beats the judge using some plausible identification technique that's dealt with the possibility of unobservables. So I suspect that noise in the human decision-making is going to be a pretty big thing. We know this from a variety of other areas. To get to the substance of what you're saying, we know that in nearly every domain that people have studied it, retest reliability is very low. If you ask somebody the same question separated by a day, you get a different answer with decent probability, even though the underlying circumstances couldn't have changed. I'm sure some of you who are grad students are thinking, that's my advisor. But your advisor is not unique. So I do think there is noise, but I think that if we're going to be building a case that algorithms can do better than humans on certain tasks, we have to start with the presumption that there's signal in the human's choice, not with the presumption that it's noise.
It's a fantastic talk and a very interesting subject. Sort of, my question is about sort of the actual process of decision making, because if we think about it, it's really not made exclusively by the doctor, but it's really an interaction between a doctor and a patient in this room. And if you think about this, it's an interesting game that they're playing, because for a doctor, no matter what incentives or disincentives you create, the cost is sort of finite. For the patient, it's a very small probability of very bad outcome. So the expected value kind of diverges. Well, I'm not an economist, so I don't value my life in $100,000 a year. So, but generally, sort of that's a diverging kind of expected value of losing my life with 10% probability. So have people thought about this sort of this game theoretical dynamics in the setting? And also, so what might be the role of patient education rather than doctor? So on the one side, you can say, actually, you may have tested sort of what's the effect on these curves if you consider patients with higher or low level of education, and whether patient education might be an alternative to best practices and guidelines that doctors are trying to follow.
It's a great question. I'll tell you one sideline before I have never in my life defended economists, so I might as well start today. You know how we get the $100,000 a year value? It actually comes from your revealed preferences, which is, like how much would you pay for a slightly safer car? It's a little ridiculous, but anyway, that's just to say we do implicitly value our lives at that rate. Not me though. I have a very safe car. No. But your point is just totally on target. I've been talking about selective labels on the left, of sort of the test outcome. But everything we measure on the right-hand side has this huge selection element, both from the patient and the doctors, what we chose. So if we start using much more of the physician notes and we could start seeing the symptoms that are reported, but it's the symptoms we chose to probe. So I think we definitely need a much richer, we are not very far on that at all. We have looked at some of the stuff around education versus not education. And to your point, it definitely seems like more affluent people drive up testing rates.
Across the board?
Across the board, yeah. We just spend more on the affluent and that they seem to know more about what to, so you're definitely right. And so that's interesting. It's good on the right hand, bad on the left. And yeah, so in fact, some of the education could be very specific about heart attack, what actually connotes a heart attack. And so what's funny now, I'm moving past well beyond my skill, but if you just go to web pages and ask, are you having a heart attack? Like half the things they tell you in there are not actually diagnostic. So many people come in and say, oh, I have a pain on my left side. It's like, why your left side? What is that? It's like on the web, they're like, oh, it's like an asymmetric pain. So there is some element of even very specific education you might be able to provide. But yeah, that's just speculation. One more question.
Is it the more affluent or the more litigious that drives it? Really, three players: the insurance company, the doctor, and the patient. And yes, the doctor gets rewarded for asking for tests, perhaps remunerated, but they're hugely punished for false negatives. If, your son or your mother doesn't get tested for the right reasons, and they develop heart attacks, no guarantee that test would have found it. You will sue them, and perhaps you should.
Yeah.
And the doctor will lose his or her practice.
Yeah.
Huge cost of not testing.
Right. So I think that's right. We don't have litigiousness. I think what Ziad says is it's not so much litigiousness, but annoying. Like, as a practical matter, there's almost no lawsuits and they feel random to doctors. But what they do know is that the patient who's like, just won't stop. And it's much easier to say, fine, stay overnight and get a stress test. And that everyday annoyance is very strong. You've seen people like this. You've known people like this. And you may think of them as your grad students. You may be one person like this. I mean, I didn't want to say anything, but but yes, I agree. And I think getting a little bit into that would be interesting. If there's one more question,
Hi.
There's one in the back. Yeah.
Yeah. So looking ahead 10, 20 years from now, what do you think are the perils and potential opportunities from really collecting labels at a in a systematic way? For instance, I heard Hal Varian from Google, chief economist at Google, saying that all systems should be learning systems. And it seems to me that we could have huge benefits from actually systematically collecting labels in our social system, not only health, judiciary, but even how we organize traffic, etc. So what are your thoughts about the perils and benefits from this?
So I think in the last 15 years, one of the things social science has learned is that if you put a lot of effort into it, randomized control trials are feasible in many social situations, not just in drug trials, which are super expensive. I think your point is totally on target. I think that something very close to a randomized control trial we'll need to start figuring out how to do them, which is a sort of a label collection trial. And I don't think there's going to be a one-size-fits-all, just to illustrate. Doing a stress test is financially expensive. So but you can at least monetize that and say, let's go ahead and collect labels in a controlled manner on people that we think are high risk but are not being tested. That's a dollar figure. Dollars are expensive, but take the opposite extreme, judicial decision making. What would it mean to have a label collection trial there? It would be, here's some people that we jailed. Why don't we just release them and see what happens? And so I think part of what we'd want to understand is, I think in the RCT world, we developed a ton of techniques, intent to treat designs, encouragement designs, magnifying natural variation. I think when we start thinking about what is the equivalent of a label collection trial, I think it'll be nice when we start getting into the weeds and figuring out what are some practical ways of doing label collection, including one-armed bandit-like things where on web platforms it's very trivial to do label collection trials, which we do all the time. We just build in noise into the system. But most social phenomena won't admit that sort of approach. All right, good. Thank you very much.